Good evening. Hello, everybody. I'm Ron Weich. I'm the Dean of the University of Baltimore School of Law. 90% of you know that, but there are a couple of visitors here, so I'm always happy to introduce myself. And I'm so proud to welcome you to yet another excellent program sponsored by our school's Faculty Research and Development Committee, chaired by the incredible Dean Michelle Gilman. So thank you, Michelle, for what has been a great series of talks. And this talk is especially interesting and important. And I'm not going to steal Michelle's thunder because she is going to introduce our colleague, Dan Hatcher. But I'll just say for myself, I am so impressed with the work that Dan Hatcher does. First of all, he's a great teacher, both in the clinic and in doctrinal stand-up podium assignments. But his scholarship is both deep and profoundly impactful, as I think we'll hear today. He reveals the injustices in these government programs that are very complicated, and the injustices sometimes hard to find, but he really does a masterful job of exposing to the world the very serious problems with these various government programs and how they affect especially children in our society. So I'm looking forward to this talk, and I'll turn the microphone over to our colleague Michelle Gilman for a formal introduction.
Thanks, Ron. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this celebration of the newly published book by Dan Hatcher, Injustice, Inc., How America's Justice System Commodifies Children and the Poor. You're going to learn a lot about that this evening. And what's really exciting is we have an interdisciplinary panel to talk about this book and how it intersects with other fields working towards social justice. So I'm going to briefly introduce our amazing panelists, and then we'll get underway. So going down the line here, first I want to introduce Eli Hager, who is an investigative reporter for the nonprofit news organization ProPublica. If you don't have that tagged on your Google Chrome, tag it. Their reporting is incredible. Eli writes about issues affecting children and families, including those living in poverty. He's a Pulitzer Prize finalist, and his work has appeared everywhere that you would possibly read: the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, and elsewhere. And we're so honored that he's here with us tonight because he is based in Phoenix. So he's come a really long way to join us and share his insights. Next to him, we have Elizabeth Rossi. She's a member of the Civil Rights Corps. She's part of their founding staff. Before joining the Civil Rights Corps, she was an attorney in the appellate division of the Maryland Office of the Public Defender, so a local friend of ours. And she also was a litigation fellow with Equal Justice Under Law. She earned a law degree from Boston University School of Law, and then she clerked on the Federal District Court for New Hampshire and the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, and you'll hear more about the type of systemic law reform litigation work that she does. And our special guest of honor, Professor Dan Hatcher, who has been teaching here in the law school in the Civil Advocacy Clinic since 2004. Before that, Dan was in a statewide position with the Maryland Legal Aid Bureau. He was the Assistant Director of Advocacy for Public Benefits and Economic Stability. He was also a staff attorney at Legal Aid, handling a massive docket representing abused and neglected children. And he was also a senior staff attorney with the Children's Defense Fund. Dan is a graduate of the University of Texas Arlington and UVA Law School. And I just have to mention, as a clinician and Dan's co-teacher, he was in court with a student today on a trial in the District Court for Baltimore County, and they won. Yeah.
The applause is for the student.
Yeah, the clients are so happy to have had the clinic help them tell their story and to be vindicated in a court of law. And so I know it was already a big day for Dan, and we're going to keep on going. It's a lot of day coming to court. Okay, so to kick us off, now I'm going to sit down and join the panel here. Dan, why don't we start with you just telling us about the core takeaway of the book and what spurred you to write it?
Sure. Well, what spurred me to write it is my clients. So as Michelle went through some of my history, I've been representing low-income clients in a variety of ways for over 25 years now. My first experience was representing children in the highly dysfunctional Baltimore foster care system. And I've represented, since that time, low-income children, low-income adults, and pretty much all poverty-related issues. And it's been overwhelming at times. It's still overwhelming. But I'm also inspired by my clients, and now also through my students. Like today in court, watching the student, I couldn't have done what she did when I was at that stage in law school. So she did excellently, and she achieved an excellent result for the clients, and both the result, but also the empowerment process and how she engaged in client-centered lawyering with the clients. And it's an honor to have the chance to teach here and with students. We have several excellent students here. So I have to thank Michelle, the dean, my wonderful colleagues are here. I can't thank Eli and Elizabeth enough for being here and joining in the discussion. I have to thank my beautifully brilliantly beautiful wife, Banafshe, who's here, who's read I don't know how many drafts of the book through the process, and here's me vent all the time when we brainstorm, and she's working on, I kind of vent about poverty, she's out there trying to fix poverty. So it's, I love you, and I'm glad that you're here as well. So my clients drive me to write this, and I've experienced so many through my clients, so many stories of hardship. Those of us who have worked with poverty know, even those of us who have lived with poverty know even more, right? It's barrier after barrier after barrier after barrier. I've said to multiple people, and I feel deeply within my heart, I know if I was in many of my clients' shoes, including many of my former child clients, I wouldn't have made it out, right? So the struggle that they have is real, and those who are able to overcome poverty, right, and work through the barriers and achieve some level, of what traditionally society might view as success, maybe even get into law school. It's superhero type efforts, right? Because the barriers don't end, and I have no idea how they can overcome. So their perseverance inspires me. After then experiencing their individual stories, I started uncovering and realizing systemic barriers, right? Starting to understand that the very systems that are intended to serve vulnerable clients are actually using vulnerable clients, right, as a source of revenue. My first book, titled The Poverty Industry, really uncovers how our human service agencies are engaged in those practices in a wide variety of ways, including partnering with private companies, one of which by the name of Maximus. And I uncovered a contract where Maximus helped the state of Maryland obtain and take disability and survivor benefits from foster children in their care. And the contract document from this company literally referred to children as a revenue generating mechanism, right? So that's not supposed to be a thing, right? Our human service agencies exist to serve, and their mission is supposed to be maximizing our welfare. So I write a lot about mission. In this book, Injustice Inc., I uncover what I fear is even more concerning, that our very systems of justice are part of the poverty industry, right? Flipping from their intended mission of equal and impartial justice, right, to maximizing equal justice towards maximizing efficiency and revenue. The courts have shifted, the prosecutors' offices have often shifted, probation departments have shifted, policing agencies, right, detention facilities, right, they're running more like a factory business, right, using vulnerable populations in this machinery, right, seeking efficiency and revenue, using those that they're supposed to serve. And the examples are really unending. In the book, I discuss how juvenile courts are entering contracts to generate revenue from child removals. The same juvenile courts generating revenue through child support proceedings that are supposed to provide assistance to children, but instead are often causing harm to low-income families. Those same courts, almost an endless other stream of revenue mechanisms that they're using, including fines and fees, now partnering with the real expert here, artificial intelligence, to be even more efficient, in their generation of revenue from the poor, making money from evictions, municipal courts literally house across the country in police departments, right? So they can collaborate more easily in this process of using the port to generate fines and fees. Prosecutor's office, attorneys general's offices statewide, right? Entering contracts to generate revenue from low-income populations that they're supposed to be serving. Entire probation departments are entering these contracts. You know, these probation departments are the size of factory wings, right? And they literally become like the factory foot soldiers in the pursuit of fines and fees, and then also entering these contracts to generate revenue, again, from child removals and from harmful, what are supposed to be helpful child support proceedings, but turning them into harmful proceedings. The list goes on when you move into policing departments, sheriff's departments, and they call them a variety of things in different jurisdictions, and city marshals and several jurisdictions, constables in some jurisdictions. You have these practices that date back to colonial times, and not in a good way, right? When you uncover what's happening. Policing agencies that are part of these same contracts, generating revenue from foster care and child support. Also, their endless participation in the pursuit of fines and fees, generating revenue from foreclosures, car repossession, seizing bank accounts, civil forfeitures, sheriff cells, using privatized police and more, even generating revenue from food intended for, right, inmates, right? You know, it's unending in the way they try to seek money. Just one stark example, I think, you know, almost symbolic. If you Google right now the New York Sheriff's Office, you'll find it's housed within the government structure of New York, within the Department of Finance, right? In terms of the Sheriff's Department. That's more than just symbolic, like when you see what's happening with our agency. So the theme is really the shift, right? You know, again, our justice institutions are supposed to serve us, right? And they're supposed to be pursuing this goal of maximizing equal justice. That's supposed to mean something. It's supposed to mean something real, right? And they have to keep their eye on the ball. You know, it's crucial. Impartiality, right? And seeking that crucial mission of equal and impartial justice. Instead, they've really sold that mission, traded it through contracts, right? To pursue revenue and profit. And I can talk about more examples, but yeah, because you can talk for a long time about this.
We will get to this for sure.
Yeah.
So before we start talking about, we're recording this, so we're trying to talk into the mics. So
Right.
you guys know. Before we talk a little bit about how both of you have engaged with Dan's work, which is so interesting, just start by telling us, and I'll start with Eli, tell us about your work at ProPublica. What is your beat? I hope journalists still use that word. I don't know. And what do you see as your journalistic mission? What are you working on now? Give us a little background.
Well, yeah, as you mentioned, I work for a nonprofit news organization called ProPublica. We report on issues in the public interest. Is this on? Okay. My beat is children and families, which I was just saying can be pretty much anything. Like every decision we make as a society affects our children and families. But I often cover juvenile justice issues. You know, one big issue that I cover is children who are charged as adults in juvenile life without parole sentences. I don't know if everybody will agree, but I find that to be one of the more extreme things that we do as a society, essentially ending somebody's life for something that they did when they were 15 or 16. And then the other big issue that I cover is child welfare and foster care issues, and that's where some of our work has intersected. I think it's a generally undercovered issue by journalists, in part because of, in many states, the courtrooms being closed and documents being sealed, which ostensibly is for the purpose of protecting kids' identities, and I can see the argument for that. But I think more often it shields these courtrooms from public scrutiny, and I don't think there's a lot of good child welfare reporting, so I've been trying to kind of crack that nut with some of my recent work. Yeah, and often looking at, I think I report on children and families, but I think often children and families in poverty or living in and around poverty. And I also, yeah, as mentioned, I live in Phoenix and I cover the southwest part of the country, so Arizona, Utah, Nevada, New Mexico, and so on. I don't know if I answered all the parts of the question there, but that sums it up.
Thank you. And Elizabeth, tell us about the work of the Civil Rights Corps, your mission, your goals, and what are you working on now?
Sure, thanks so much. So, Civil Rights Corps is a small legal nonprofit. We're based in Washington, D.C., and we were founded in 2016. So we've really only been at this for about 7 years or so. But our model, our mission is to work in close collaboration with directly impacted communities, grassroots organizations, to use a variety of interventions from litigation to policy to narrative storytelling to build power in impacted communities toward abolitionist goals. So our work to date has really focused primarily on the criminal legal system. We've filed over 17 lawsuits challenging pretrial detention and cash bail. We have dockets challenging debtors' prisons, private probation, some of the issues that Dan's talked about in his book, conflicts of interest in the court, judges in New Orleans who are making money for themselves by setting higher bail amounts. My work lately has taken me in the direction of really thinking about the criminal legal system as not just a system of mass human caging, but also a system of mass family separation. And that sort of thinking, that sort of framework has really led me to the family policing, family regulation system, which is how I, started to interact with Dan Hatcher's amazing research. And so some of the work that I have on my plate right now really focuses on family separation, both in the criminal system and the family policing system, and also building out a docket of projects that are really based in Maryland and Baltimore, which is where I'm from and where I live. So even though the organization is national and based in DC, I've got a lot on my plate lately that is really local.
All right, so building from there, Dan, I think it would be helpful if you could just break down one of your examples. I was thinking of, you said how juvenile courts are generating revenue from child removal. Like, break that down for us. Who is paying them? What are they getting paid to do? What exactly is a conflict of interest? So I think if we can unpack one of those examples, our audience will see how absolutely insane it is what you have uncovered.
Sure, and this example with the juvenile courts in Ohio is happening in multiple states, and the example of the juvenile court contracts with foster care funds is an example of many other similar contracts, right? So it's really just scratching the surface, but it's pretty stark when you start to dig into it. So I uncovered the actual contracts out of Ohio, and this is happening again in other states, including Illinois, Louisiana, and more, Texas in a slightly different way, and I can talk more about that. But the Ohio courts, the juvenile courts, what they're doing is actually entering contracts to become the local foster care placing agency, right? And if we just pause to think about that for a second, we had a Revolutionary War some years ago. It was out of concern of escaping tyranny, right, and centralized power in the hands of one entity, at that point the English crown. Right, so the separation of powers is a crucial construct, in terms of the form of our government, the separation between the courts and the executive branch and the legislature. So here you have the juvenile courts actually contract and become part of the executive branch to take on the local foster care agency role. And then what the courts do is they put on their court hat, adjudicate a child delinquent, right, and then that allows them to put on their contractual foster care placing agency hat, remove a child from the home, or label a child a foster care candidate constant risk of removal and processing and monitoring. Sometimes even placing the child in a residential treatment center operated by the court, right? And then the court puts its judge hat back on, rules on its own actions, right, acting as the foster care agency, and if it rules on itself favorably, it can generate more revenue, and it pulls down what are called federal Title IV foster care funds, right? And this is happening in the millions of dollars that the courts are drawing down. And it's not just that example. As I dug in further, I found training slides, where the courts are instructed on how they can maximize this revenue. They have entered contracts. Most of the juvenile courts in Ohio have entered contracts with a private revenue maximization contractor by the name of Justice Benefits Inc., no irony there, and not just through their process of pulling down 4E revenue, this federal foster care funding stream that is intended for foster care agencies, right? The courts found a way to tap into that. not just about services, but their the bigger funding mechanism that they're using is using the children through this process to generate administrative cost recovery, right? And that sounds boring at first, when you think about, administrative costs, but what they're doing is literally using children to fund overhead of the justice systems, from paying salaries and fringe benefits. I mean, just about everything you can think of, literally paying for depreciation of courthouse buildings, right? I even found an example where they can claim the administrative costs. I have to think about this because it becomes complicated. They can claim the administrative costs of the process of claiming administrative costs, right? So it becomes like almost unending, that they're using the children to pull down this revenue. And if anybody's worked in a nonprofit before, the idea like overhead, like you get in trouble with a nonprofit if your overhead percentage ends up being like greater than say 15%, something like that. These court structures, we're talking 300%, sometimes, where the overhead is more than 3 times, the services that they're pulling down. It's not just the courts, right? Then the prosecutors are doing the same things. Prosecutors are earning similar contracts where they can literally generate more revenue if more poor children, not any children, poor children are removed from their homes, right? Those same courts, and I'll pause there, but you just keep going, down this rabbit hole of harmful contracts. The same courts that maybe generate revenue by removing a child from their home, right, will then have another contract to pursue the poor parent, say the poor mother, for something they call child support, but it's actually owed to pay back the cost of foster care, right? And then the court's going to generate more contractual revenue from pursuing that poor mother for paying back the cost of foster care that the court just ordered. Right, and then the probation departments jump into it, the prosecutor's offices, the policing agencies, right? So they're generating revenue from harm, and the process of researching this is really overwhelming, and it's candidly emotional at times because I believe in equal justice. I believe in the goal of equal justice. I don't believe we're there. I don't believe we've ever been there, but I believe we have to have that goal, right? And we have to strive for it. And those of us who work in the justice systems, right, we have to be the champions of striving for that goal. And if our justice institutions are selling or contracting away that goal for the pursuit of revenue, right, then we're not in a good position.
So one quick follow-up question. So the more poor children that the courts adjudicate delinquent and the more poor children that they put in foster care, they make more money. It's on a head-to-head basis.
Right, and there's math equations. The children are literally plugged into equations, and one of them is what's called the penetration rate, which is used. And I've seen this in some of the contracts with prosecutors' offices in terms of figuring out how much revenue they're going to pull down in federal funds based upon their contracts with the amount of children that are pulled into the system. And what the penetration rate is literally the percentage of poor children compared to non-poor children who are removed from their homes, right? So the more poor children, right, that are taken from the families compared to non-poor children, the prosecutors' offices, the courts, the probation departments are going to pull in more revenue.
Right, because these are like social welfare dollars. Yeah. Elizabeth, how did you become aware of Dan's work and how is it intersecting with what you're doing in your mission?
Yeah, so I, as I mentioned, sort of started researching family separation in the U.S., sort of in support of a investigation I'm doing into jails that have eliminated in-person family visits. And so I started to sort of look at the broader context of family separation in the U.S. And I came across actually a different reporter's amazing work, Joe Shapiro with NPR on termination of parental rights cases in North Carolina where parents are losing their rights to their children solely because they can't make child support payments. And not only that, but those child support payments like go to the state. They don't even go to the custodial parent. And this was shocking, and it also really implicates some of the constitutional issues that we've been litigating in our bail and debtors prison cases about how, you can't lock someone up just because they can't pay, right? Like you can't lock them up. You can't take away their kids either. You would think that like you can't sort of have those barriers to justice just based on poverty and access to cash. And so Joe had actually covered some of my work on private probation cases in Tennessee. And so I reached out to him. I talked to him a little bit about his investigation, and he said, "Oh, you got to talk to Dan Hatcher." And he said he's in Baltimore, and I was like, "Oh, that's great. I'm in Baltimore too." And I actually reached out to Dan on like the same day that you had sent me the galleys for your book. So this is a really great sort of coincidence. And we started talking, and I read the book, and really the chapter. There's so much in here that's just truly horrifying. I mean, it's really horrifying. And I think also shocking, as you mentioned, Eli, that so much of this kind of goes under the radar in our society. But the chapter on the conflicts of interest and separation of powers issues in the Ohio courts just really stunned me. And that was sort of the subject of some of our initial conversations. And I've been working with some folks on my team at CRC to file Public Information Act requests for other contracts in other counties in Ohio, and trying to talk to folks on the ground in Ohio about these issues and see how they've come up and what sort of how those conflicts manifest on a day-to-day basis. And you'd actually connected me to a person who's worked in the court system for decades. And so, that's sort of how we met, and I'm trying to build on and sort of learn from what Dan has been doing, and identify whether there are ways that we might be able to intervene in a litigation capacity, and then also in a narrative capacity, right? Like telling the story so that more people can be outraged and appalled, and hopefully things will change.
So chapter 4 might be a class action
Oh yeah.
coming down the pipe.
4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Like,
Yeah, the whole book. It's like keep you busy for the rest of your career. So Eli, you're in such an exciting position from our perspective because you can really bring these stories out of the shadows, which you said that is a big part of your mission. How did you become aware of Dan's work, and how have you both collaborated and influenced each other?
Yeah, when I saw you were going to ask this question, you'll have to correct me, because I mean, we've been talking about
for a
stories
while.
for like 7 years or
Yeah.
so, I'm not positive what the first interaction was, but I think it was when I was writing a story at my previous job, was at the Marshall Project, which is another nonprofit news organization that covers criminal justice issues. And I was writing about the issue of essentially parents being billed for the cost of their kids' own incarceration. Like a teenager would be sent to a juvenile detention facility for something, and then the parents, unbeknownst to them, would be getting a check in the mail for the cost of like the room and board of their jail cell, which I think you can see why that would be an issue that I would turn to Dan to, because it's kind of the same idea of government agencies that are supposed to be providing a public service, which anything having to do with public safety is supposed to be a public service, but funding it on the backs of the people in that system, often who don't have very much money. And I can't remember if it was you or somebody else who said it's like, charging people for each time they use the fire department or something. It's supposed to be a public service. And it seemed especially cruel because parents obviously don't want their kids in jail, so to then send them a check for it. And so we started talking, and that was an issue that I think Dan had worked on before, and kind of directed me to some experts and folks to talk to. The one other time that we've worked together very extensively on a story was about that issue that you were briefly mentioning there about foster care agencies that mine foster children for revenue, children who have had a parent pass away and are entitled to this Social Security survivor benefits, or who have a disability and are entitled to disability benefits, and that money's theirs under federal law, but these agencies kind of look through literally comb through the list of foster children in their care and see which ones might be eligible for these benefits and then take the benefits from them. And I feel like that was an issue that kind of was a good example of how we can work together, because Dan really, I don't know if you were the first to ever write about that, you can say, but I mean, you really looked into it, and you knew who to talk to, you knew which documents to ask for and all of that. I think what I could provide was talking to lots and lots of the children affected, and
All the way out to Alaska.
yeah, in Alaska, we did the story in Alaska, and kind of finding those things that would make it an issue that general audience readers would be really compelled by and find sympathetic, and that was kind of like my half of the work. Yeah, I think our interest in this is really around. And I think sometimes poverty is, people think of poverty as this like immovable force, like I don't know, like globalization happened and Ronald Reagan's a bad guy and stuff like that. But it's like happening every time policymakers write a budget. You know, it's a choice. And I think Dan has identified a number of the ways in which that's true, and then I take his ideas and write about it.
That was an amazing series. And as I recall, it was both in print and on NPR. So it was both in print and audio. Yeah, that was incredible. And the kids, a little more grown up than kids, but who talked to you, how did you get them to come forward and tell their stories? It was really powerful.
I mean, sometimes I feel like a teenager myself. And I was formerly an 8th grade teacher. I maybe should have said that in a previous answer. My interest in, I was a teacher before. Yeah, I mean, the same things that you need to do in any type of relationship, like be on time and go and stick to your promises, especially with kids. I think those things are really important. And being very transparent about who you are, also who you're not. Like I'm not a social worker, I'm not a therapist. You know, I think kids especially appreciate it when you see that level of, I guess, transparency. But also like quantity, like there's a lot of kids who just, you know, wait. You know, the fact that I was talking to doesn't put that.
Yeah. It's an amazing series. Everyone look it up. All right. So a lot of people would think, okay, law professors, they're sitting in their ivory tower, they're writing about their philosophy or their theories, that it's a very sort of isolated work where we're just talking to other academics. Okay, that's sort of the stereotype. So what I want to ask you both, and I'll start with Elizabeth, is, well, how can the work of an academic support what you're doing, intersect with what you're doing as a legal activist on the ground? How common is it for you to engage with academic work? How can we build those bridges to be useful? Yeah.
Yeah, so I have had the good fortune to work with academics in a variety of capacities. So certainly this is one way that I can interact with a researcher, right? Like you've uncovered amazing things and you've sort of teed up the facts that I can kind of continue to dig into and investigate whether there's a way to actually challenge them in order to change the system. So that's sort of one way. Another way, you know, we at CRC are trying to bring innovative legal claims. Like we want to push the envelope. We want to move the law in new directions. And that's often what law professors are doing. They're looking at the doctrine. They're looking at how have cases been decided and how could the doctrine be pushed in a way that is more fair, that is closer to equal justice, that makes the promise of due process like more and more of a reality. But professors aren't in a position to actually like implement those things, you know? And I'm not in a position to be able to research them at the level of sort of depth and sophistication that law professors are. And so that's a natural sort of synergy, right? For me to read and understand their work and then figure out how it might be able to be turned into a lawsuit or some other sort of practical application. You know, so we've I've been able to work with professors who have done research on both like procedural issues, like how do we get into federal court? How do we hold the particular government officials who've done the bad thing responsible? Because there's so many doctrines that federal courts have concocted to prevent themselves from doing justice. And law professors have spent a lot of time thinking about how we might get around some of those. And then also the substantive issues. So I'm able to talk to law professors who've been sort of analyzing Bearden or analyzing Salerno, these sort of key Supreme Court cases that come up in our lawsuits all the time. And then sort of the third category is really social science research and folks who are conducting really rigorous research showing the real world impacts of some of the reforms that we're pushing for. And what comes to mind are Paul Heaton and Megan Stevenson, who are law professors. They were both previously at Quattro Center. Megan has moved on, but they have done just incredible research looking at the effects of eliminating cash bail and dramatically decreasing pretrial detention in Harris County, where one of or a couple of my big cases have been. And that research and those findings have been huge in pushing back on the fear mongering and then the narrative in the media about how decarceral bail reform is causing the murderers and rapists to run free. And so, being able to incorporate the work of social scientists into the litigation and into the courtroom, testifying as experts in front of judges is really lent like credibility and also just, again, practical, like, well, we can point to something that says this is actually why this makes sense, leaving aside the law, like this is why as a policy matter, this is a good change.
It's very exciting to hear about those synergies. Definitely. And so similar question to you, Eli, how does the work of academics intersect with an investigative journalist? I imagine you don't have so much time to sit around, reading lengthy tomes or, God forbid, law review articles. So just how does that synergy happen for you in your field?
Can I just ask a question? Like, how did law review articles come to be so unreadable?
There are law review articles about that. There is an entire world of law review articles on that issue. One thing I will say in defense of law review articles, it's nice that they're free and open access. Unlike social science, which is often behind a paywall and can be really hard to access, we're fortunate that our knowledge, anyone can access it. But you're right, if it's impenetrable and too long and too complicated, that doesn't really help. Many have queried the same, yeah.
No, I mean, I think having one of my first editors, I pitched something that was overly broad as a story, and he said that's a subject, not a story, and I've kind of always kept that in mind. And I think the best folks in academia who I've worked with have had a really good sense of that distinction. What's a story versus what's a subject? In a book you can obviously cover more ground, but I'm really looking for something that's a story, and Dan, I think you're pretty good about thinking about this, and obviously because we are in the news profession, this is a little bit unfortunate, but if there's something that's like a news peg that makes it feel timelier in some way, whether it's like a trend like Ohio's doing it, Texas doing it, like there's many places doing it type of thing, or a recent case or court decision that we can kind of tie it to and make it feel timelier. It's a little bit artificial, but it's people are more likely to want to read about something that's going on now, as opposed to kind of like, since 1910 this has been going on, the same way, even though that's obviously important as well. I'm trying to think like, obviously if there are, editors love documents and they love data. And if either of those things are kind of part of a story, it's much more likely to be greenlit. And then I think just generally another thing that you do well is, journalists were essentially learning as a profession each time we do a story, and that's what I like about it, because I'm a curious person. But it does mean that we're going to have a learning curve, right? I haven't been immersed in this subject for as long as somebody who's been an academic or an attorney has been, and so kind of a willingness to be our guide a little bit, and hopefully there'll be some reward in some way for that in the end if it makes it a better story. But yeah, I know, like, just be patient with us, I guess. Yeah.
And I know you're trying to have an impact in the world. That's what fuels you. So how important is it for you to engage in other fields? How do you facilitate that? How do you make it happen?
I pester these two all the time.
It's a good strategy. It's
Um,
working.
I want to keep trying to do better, at that, to think about ways in which I can engage with other fields and other professionals in the fields in which I'm working. So I like, if I can provide assistance, I think these two have the ability to change the world much more than I do, both in terms of their roles and their capacities. Right? If you get to know them and their skill sets. So if I can provide some assistance to them, that's both an honor and that works towards my goal, of wanting to help work towards those solutions. I also I see the ability to be sort of symbiotic about it, right? Because in this book, I actually cite both work from Civil Rights Corps and some of Eli's work and many other journalists and examples of excellent litigation around the country, right? So I'm learning from your all's work, and then I hope as that inspires me to do research, right, I can provide more information that might provide fuel to you all, as it goes forward, and it continues like that in terms of that symbiotic relationship. And I think we do have to reach outside of our comfort zones, sometimes, like in terms of not just us in the legal field of academia, to reach outside to others outside of the legal field and thinking about the social sciences. Math scares me, but as I dig into, how some of these equations that I try to read about in the book and some of the funding mechanisms, I almost wish I could go back and get a finance or an accounting degree, something to better understand, what's happening. Artificial intelligence, scares me even more. And as you're reaching out to so many people in interdisciplinary fields to understand what's happening all around us, right? I think it couldn't be more important. It's coming, whether we like it or not, right? And I hope we can all become part of the solution, or at least way to drive it as much as we can in the better direction rather than in the harmful.
Okay, I have just a few more questions, then we're going to open it up for Q&A. So think about questions you have for our panelists. But Dan, I'm going to stay with you for a minute. Tell us a bit about the solutions you propose in the book, because you're not all doom and gloom. You do try and be constructive, which I appreciate. And what is the ultimate impact you hope to have with this book now that it's out in the world? It's only been out 2 months so far.
Right.
So.
Well, I don't spend a lot of time getting into detailed solutions in the book on purpose, but I think the solutions, really are simple in their themes, mission and ethics, which I write about a lot. We need to, I believe in the mission of government, right, and of our human service agencies and of our justice institutions. That mission to maximize welfare and that mission to maximize equal justice, right? So at least to work in that direction. The ethics, right, are supposed to what drives us as flawed humans toward those ideals, right? So the ethics are crucial as a part of this. I think, we need more, so much change. It always starts with awareness. So the work both of these two are doing cannot be more important. The work that you're doing, and putting on event after event in terms of highlighting scholarship cannot be more crucial, and hoping to increase awareness. If we're going to work towards change, right, we need to have awareness, and if we're going to try to fix something, it needs to be the right fix, right, to understand what we're working towards. We're going to need more, unfortunately, litigation, around the country. If our justice systems aren't righting their own wrongs, right, then we're going to have to bring them to account, for their wrongs. And we need storytelling so the masses understand. The work that Eli and other journalists like Eli are doing could not be more important. We're seeing some success on this particular issue with foster children's benefits now being preserved. Now over 10 states have started to move in the right direction, either through legislation or sometimes taking their own initiatives. At least 2 cities I had a chance to work, both in District of Columbia and Philadelphia on legislation. That spur happened in significant part because of the series that Michelle talked about that Eli and Joe Shapiro worked on, right? So it caused a spark, right? And then another state moves in the right direction, and then that takes hold, and then another state keeps moving in the right direction. So good change is possible. I think, I can't say enough, I believe in the mission of equal justice, right? We're not there, but I believe we have to strive for that ideal. If we stop striving for the ideal, then ideals tend to be replaced with their opposites, right? So it could not be more important. And in the conclusion of the book, I write about, somebody who would always, and we still have this every year, but Chief Judge Bell, who would give our speech to students in the swearing-in ceremony for our clinic students before he retired. This is still a practice that we do, but every time he would give this speech, he would talk about one of his poems that was a favorite of his that he called The Guy in the Glass. And it's a simple but beautiful poem, and it's really about like only we know really, what we're doing in the end of the day when you look at yourself in the mirror. It's that honest mirror of self-reflection, right? And we teach this in the clinic, the importance of self-reflection. And, just the way he talked about it and that importance. So us in the justice system, that ethical mirror, that honest mirror of self-reflection, that's hard to do if you do it for real, especially on an individual level. So we have to, as systems, right, as individuals in the systems, have that honest mirror of self-reflection. If we individually are trying our best, if I'm a judge, if I'm a prosecutor, if I'm a probation official, right, if I'm trying my best to be ethically true, right, if I'm working in a system that's constitutionally and ethically compromised, then I am ethically and constitutionally compromised, right? We have to look beyond ourselves. And I also so his story too is just such a striking arc in that moving towards justice. So if many people probably don't realize the story about Chief Judge Bell. When he was 16, he was prosecuted, arrested for simply being black, eating in a whites-only restaurant in this area in Maryland. He was a named plaintiff in a case that went up to the Supreme Court. And one of the prosecutors for Chief Judge Bell became the Chief Judge of Maryland first, Murphy, right, who the building is named after. Chief Judge Bell rose to replace Murphy as Chief Judge, so that arc is striking, and the man, to hear him talk, about the importance of that honest mirror of ethical self-reflection sticks with me. And I think we all have to have that as we move forward.
He is very inspiring,
Yeah.
Chief Judge Bell, and a good friend to the law school. All right, so Ela, what did you learn from Dan's book, Injustice, Inc., that you didn't know before, and do you think it'll shape your reporting going forward in a specific or general way?
Yeah, there's two kind of broad areas that I want to write about some before, but that I want to write about more and have more conversations with Dan based on this book. A lot of times when you do child welfare system reporting, you hear a lot of the families affected say things to the effect of, this is all about money, our babies are being trafficked, and sometimes I feel that I might have been overly dismissive toward those points of view because it sounds a little conspiratorial sometimes when people are saying, my child was removed and is not being trafficked because of the financial incentive. But I think there's a lot based on some what I was reading about that particular system. There's a lot of merit to the. There really is money for state agencies to make the more approvals they do, and the more kids they have in adoption subsidies and so forth. And so I want to maybe do some more work on that area. And the other is just I've done a couple stories about different aspects of child support issues, but speaking of issues that aren't covered very much or very well by journalists, I'm not quite sure why it's this massive system, billions of dollars flowing across state lines. It can be an important safety net for families in poverty, but it's also it can also drive families apart, and as you mentioned, money doesn't always go to families, and so on. I just feel like I want to do a big series about child support. So I want to think about what the
there definitely has not. I'm very much looking forward to that series, and starting with knowledge, as Dan said, like making people aware so that we can generate reforms. All right, Elizabeth, you already told us a little bit about how you're starting to work on some systemic litigation based on some of the things Dan uncovered. You talked a little bit about the different doctrines that can be barriers to moving cases forward. Tell us, like, if you're looking toward the future, like, how many years does one of these large lawsuits take? How much people power is behind it? What sort of commitment is required to see it through? How often do you guys succeed? Like, if we're looking at our crystal ball, where's this litigation going?
It's a really big question. There's a lot of ingredients to a litigation project that is successful. And it's really not just the litigation. Actually, the lawsuit is often the least important part of the broader goal to change some system. And so when I'm, in the process of really talking with organizers and advocates and impacted folks and parent defense lawyers all over the country right now, trying to understand where is the organizing energy, where are the policy goals most well developed, and where is there a sort of theory of change where a lawyer coming in with a litigation option could be leveraged into something that would really build power in those communities and make the system fairer. So and then sort of a second piece of that is what aspect of this huge, monstrous, sprawling, expensive system could we attack that would really undermine the legitimacy or help people see how illegitimate the system is at its core. So that's what's so appealing to me about the conflicts of interest piece of it. Another piece that I think is really compelling are the, which you had mentioned, Eli, are the First Amendment issues relating to how closed these courts are, right? So these courts across the country have weaponized this concept of the best interest of the child and parents patriae to do extreme violence to these same children and these same families. And so brainstorming around ways of opening those courts so that reporters can come in, so that these assumptions about what's happening in these spaces can be undermined, are things that are at the top of my mind. But thinking about those goals, it all kind of evolves organically, right? It's who are our partners? What are their goals? What types of co-counsel do we need in order to push this forward? We're not the only organization thinking about this. There's plenty of other litigators and folks who've been fighting these systems for a while. And so it's a whole process of coalition building and thinking about how our unique sort of skills and experiences can contribute to this movement. But the cases take a really, really long time. How you define success, I don't really know. How often do we succeed? We had a great success in Harris County, 3 years ago, and the Fifth Circuit just, dumped on it on Friday. So, it's kind of exactly. And success can be defined in lots of different ways. So it's complicated.
Right. Okay, we want to open it up for some questions from the audience. Yes, Rob.
Hi, this is a wonderful panel, and thank you so much. I learned so much. I don't know very much about this topic, so the one thing that stood out to me as you were talking was that I was a little shocked to learn that these are federal dollars that are being used in this system, and it made me think, who is the person at the Department of Justice or HHS or wherever that money is coming from, who's asleep at the switch? Right. Are they not a pressure point? What's keeping them from, because that seems like easier lift than trying to persuade a federal judge.
I think it's a great question because they're federal dollars flowing to states, right? And some of this could be fixed through either federal legislation, but a lot doesn't even need legislative change. There's clear enough language where if the agencies clarified some guidance, wouldn't even need a new regulation sometimes, just some of the guidance that they put out. We're trying actually this issue that Eli mentioned with foster children's Social Security benefits. Social Security benefits. We've had multiple discussions with the leadership at ACF, Administrative Children and Families, under HHS, and also the Social Security Administration leadership to try to get them to fix it through that kind of guidance. The flow of Title IV-E funds and Title IV-D funds, I think that's a great thought, and I would love to try to, if folks have good contacts now, you know, they're always changing to try to reach out, you know, because they could fix it tomorrow, right? That's what's so frustrating, like with a lot of these issues, they know what's happening, right? You know, and this is like, you know, my politics probably becomes pretty obvious when I talk about a lot of issues, but a lot of the issues also I've researched are happening in blue states and in red states, right? That you know, like some of the legislation I've worked on talking about the issue that Eli wrote about, right? That's been getting pushback from both governors in red states and in blue states. So like, you know, I think it's a great thought, and I think we have to do it all, you know, more journalism, more litigation, more reaching out to the agency leadership to try to get them to just fix things on their own.
Dave.
Again, thank you for the panel. It's great. And I hate complimenting the panel, but I'm curious about, Danny, you're talking about this role that the courts are playing where they are adopting the executive branch role, and then they have this obvious conflict of interest. And it sounded so much like a lot of specialized courts. And I'm wondering what was the role of the specialized court movement in contributing to this problem and how they have to work together.
I think it's a great question. Like, and like, I hope someone researches more than, you know, handoff, right? No, but yeah, you know, and it's not just with the foster care contracts. I mean, almost every state is engaged in this type of contract in the child support proceedings. Sometimes it's where they enter the contracts where I've seen, like in Ohio, it's the contractual language. The executive branch child support agency has language where they're literally buying court orders, right, in terms of the contractual language. And then in Pennsylvania, statewide, the family courts have contracted to become the local child support agencies. And like the Ohio courts, they're ruling on their own actions. The statewide attorney general's office in Texas, right, they took on the foster care agency role statewide, and then they fund contractually the courts, right? So the same thing where they're paying the salaries, the fringe benefits, even the bar dues, right, of the judges that they appear before, right? And then it's not just that conflict, right? If you think about the Ohio contracts where the juvenile courts contract to take on the local foster care agency role. So that's an obvious, you know, separation of powers concerns and due process concerns. Then they also succumb to the executive branch. They take on the local agency, right, function, and then they're agreeing to be submissive to the state agency in the contractual language. So you have the courts literally becoming submissive to the executive branch. So but you're right, you know, in terms of you know, the drug courts, I mean, all the different specialty courts and thing, I think there's a lot of concern. And well, they're even more apt to be building into AI as an example of which to make it even faster and how they can pull down the revenue.
And just add that when I have to teach, so I'm not leaving because I hate
We're going to have a reception after this, so Dave, please feel free to grab a snack before you go, or anyone wants to leave. Barbara.
So I found this really fascinating, and what came to my mind, like right in the early part of your presentation,
Allergies.
about how
Yeah,
agencies or the courts are using this to, you know, get federal funds into that. When you see this happening in a private industry,
Yeah.
The money goes to typically the shareholders of the company, or more often the salaries of the people who are running the companies. Their salaries get enhanced.
Right.
What I was wondering is, you see all this flow of money, do you know where it's going? Because I don't know, but I
Yeah.
have the impression that salaries were set by the legislature, so
Yeah.
where's all this money piling up?
It's a great question. Sometimes, you know, I found examples of that, but I'm just scratching the surface. And that, like, I mean, it's a great question. But I did find examples, like I say, out of Cuyahoga County, where these contracts, where they then draw down the 4E revenue, right, to as the foster care revenue that they receive through these contracts, you know, from child removals, to increase salaries for everybody in the court system.
That's what I was wondering.
And some examples, some prosecutors are getting direct incentive payments. It's not just there's a flow of federal dollars in child support called Title IV-D from the federal government to the states. And within that structure, they're literally called incentive payments. Some prosecutors are getting that directly in some jurisdictions. Some sheriffs, to be sure, like in terms of how much they're pulling down. New York, the city marshals in New York, they're private. They're called city marshals, but they're private. They don't even earn a salary, right? The only money they make is through their bounty. The bounty is pursuing the poor, right? And all these different ways that are read off. The average city marshal in New York net, right? After cost, $420,000 a year.
That's their salary.
That's their pull down revenue. They don't have a salary. That's just how much money they're making from pursuing the poor.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. So
That there's any-
yeah, that's their take home, right? So it's scary. Like when you dig. But even if it's not, even if it's a judge who has a set salary, right? If it's set by the legislature, if they're bringing in more money for their court system, right? And take on the mindset where they need to grow. That's what they're thinking more like that private company, right? Growth, economic development, almost, right? And to do that, they need the commodities. The commodities are the kids, right? Or the low-income adults. They're pulling them through like widgets, like what you said.
And the idea that they're wanting to grow is really prestige.
Yeah.
Right? Because it's nothing more.
Right.
Than, it's
Build a brand new, beautiful court building, right? Like where they pull in more revenue. Meanwhile, everybody who walks into that beautiful court building don't look that good, right? In terms of their circumstances that they're struggling with.
Jose.
Well, Dan, first of all, I want to say how proud I am of you to be your colleague. I've watched you do this over the years. Just such exciting work, and I appreciate the panelists coming today. I guess my question is that allies in the fight, is there some organization that can be weaponized in the local community? People with these stories, between the subject and a story, right?
Yeah.
We need to find these effective people because people do respond to stories.
Yeah.
Is there some path to finding a people or group or organizational infrastructure where the horror stories of these forgotten people can somehow be collected and then we can get behind them? We can complain about red light cameras, which is saying kind of
Right.
profit-centered
Yeah.
model and whatever. But where do we get the people to support these things you have discovered? They've got to be out there.
Yeah. Well, you're looking at them, right? I don't mean to hand out but a truly excellent investigative journalist, has that capacity. You also know your limitations. I think I'm good at digging into the data and a little bit more like the wonky side. Banafsha and I talk about this. I'm not nearly as good at Eli and uncovering, right, those stories that are going to change minds, right? This is just one issue of the foster children Social Security benefits. I started writing about that. That was my first law review article back in 2004. And so I've been, pounding my head against the wall for a long time. That issue, his story, in Joe's work, spurred the action going forward. Excellent. The Eli's in the world and local journalists have the ability to change the world. So I think us as academics, us as lawyers and advocates, we need to do better in trying to provide tools and the resources and information reaching out to journalists.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, and subscribe to local newspapers.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that the dwindling of local newspapers is why we don't know more of these stories. There's fewer reporters than there's ever been. Not in a literal sense, but it's not been good. So.
It's not good for democracy.
Yeah.
Yeah. Colin.
I think my question is something of a follow-up on Barbara's, and perhaps most directly addressing. And it's, what is your sense of the motivation of the people that are sort of rebellions in the school? Telling, having spoken. It seems that there's some instances where there's a pure kind of profit motive.
No.
It struck me when you were saying you previously had thought the idea that people were being trafficked sounds conspiratorial, and now maybe not so much. But I mean, I do see it. It's not the same thing as clearly with criminal trafficking. I'm sure the folks that are in the system aren't seeing themselves as criminal, and there's resistance that you're encountering from very high levels. So I'm just wondering, what's the barrier? What's the self-conception? How are they seeing themselves? Have you spoken with those when you sort of
let you go.
Well, I mean, I think what I meant by that comment is just I don't think individual, CPS caseworkers are seeing dollar signs in their eyes when they're going out to homes to look into allegations of abuse and neglect. They're not saying this is a kid who, if we take him, we'll get those federal dollars. It's more about how the whole state agency is functioning and profiting. But honestly, I feel like the villain in some ways is bad tax policy because it's like,
No.
I mean, because like, I don't know if that connection is going to make sense, so I'll try to say what I mean. But like, I live in Arizona, Nevada, and Utah are right next door. These are not states that tax businesses and the wealthy in the way that they should. They have relatively low revenue coming in, and but they have these federal funding streams, and they're like, oh, okay, well we can pay for foster care with that, and we don't have to, have a more progressive tax code. And I don't know if you would agree with that strong of a statement, but I do think a lot of it flows from, these agencies don't have a lot of revenue where they should be getting it,
Mhm.
and so they're trying to find these other sneaky ways of developing the revenue off some of that. The people who literally have the least money, so it's kind of a paradox. I don't know.
I agree with that. I think if we had better systems of sufficient, fair taxation, right, to fund the agencies at the level that they need. They need revenue to the extent that they need it, right? Because many of the agencies, their roles should be to put themselves out of business, right? So they don't exist. They shouldn't be about growth, But once they start, once they have to look towards these other sources rather than just using a fair, equitable means of funding. Same with their courts. And they start operating more like that business mindset, right? The whole structure starts to take on that mindset, and they're shifting gradually until it's almost too late, right? And all of a sudden, the whole operations has become about efficiency and revenue. Like you start looking, like in my research, like annual report after annual report across the country of the courts, prosecutors, their audit reports and things like it. It reads more like a presentation to a group of investors, right, to a report about equal justice. So they've lost their way, even more than they already had lost their way, right, and they're doing the shift towards revenue. They're run like a business.
All right. Well, with that, Heather, do you have a question? Yeah, let's do one more question and then we'll break for refreshments and chatter. Yeah.
Oh, Elizabeth is hiding over here too.
Allergy attack. No direct question.
No.
It's hard. Really, really inspiring. You talked a lot about the lack of transparency, being such a barrier to uncovering this.
Yeah.
And some of even some really helpful specific anecdotes about how you overcome that. And my question is, I want to hear a little bit more about that. I'll just share a little bit sort of my framework on why. I'm more recently serving on a working group for the Criminal Justice Coordinating Council here, looking at fines and fees issues. And it is just amazing the barriers to getting basic information.
Right.
Like the judiciary not being responsive to how fines and fees are working, who they're being levied against, and disproportionately so, what that revenue is then being used for. And with arguments such as, well, we can't remain seen as impartial if we supply this information.
Yeah.
And then a basic bill in the legislature this year in Annapolis to start after many compromises. Can we at least have a working group just to kind of unearth, some of how fines and fees? But it died, couldn't make it. And one of the reasons we need more proof. Like we want to see the FOIA requests and the email requests to show that it's a problem that you can't get information. And so, Dan, earlier in the panel, you mentioned something like, I was looking at the training materials of how the staff, how did you obtain that? And obviously, Eli, with your work as an investigative journalist, you have so many ways that you go about obtaining information. So I'd love to hear just more of your wisdom on that.
Great question.
Well, I'm neurotic, right? And so when I go, when I fall into the matrix, and one will lead to another, and lead to another, and I never come out. But But, so like a lot of the things I found were hidden in plain sight, but that takes a lot of digging, right? And then others through, formal public records requests. But it's a great comment because, as Eli talked about, even you have this huge concern with confidential systems, right? In terms of like, how do you get behind that shroud of confidentiality? But even in those systems that aren't, fully confidential, like in the clinic, getting access to records for our clients is often one of the biggest, hugest hurdles, and they have lawyers, right, who are trying to help them. So any individual who's trying to get their own Department of Social Services records, I have no idea how they do. They usually never do. So how can they ever accurately appeal, right, or take action in their case when they don't even have access to their own records? Healthcare records, right? We just had an unemployment insurance case where the student was like, because the healthcare provider was unwilling to provide their own healthcare records, right? It's like one issue after another, after another, after another. Like if I had a magic wand of financing, hint, hint, to maybe like a new clinic, I always thought it would be so cool to have a clinic working on doing FOIA litigation for journalists, right? Like in terms of helping in that seeking out information. Maybe we'll start it right here. I'll get the contract out and.
Yeah, I wish I had things like discovery and
Yeah.
something like that.
Yeah.
It is frustrating that, like you're talking about legislation, that legislative branch stuff usually you can't make, or like emails between legislators and stuff you can't make public records requests for. Same with private companies, but if there's anywhere where the private companies and the executive branch agencies are interacting, that's maybe where, because I think that's where Dan has found a lot of stuff, is that there's correspondence, whether it's literal correspondence or contracting documents, requests for proposals and things like that, that is covered by public records laws because it's the executive branch agencies in that particular state that are doing that. So you can get some insight into private companies through like how the document trail of how they interact with the public agencies. Some things that I do, like every time I go anywhere and I'm looking for people who are affected by these systems, I always have lots of like releases in hand, saying that it's okay for me to request their records of their individual case, or I help walk them through the process of requesting the documentation of what happened to them. They're allowed to ask for it. I'm not allowed to just randomly ask for it as a third party, but if I have those releases in hand, that can sometimes work. And yeah, bugging attorneys a lot. They might be, lawyers might have clients, who have gone through something like this, and obviously lawyers need to make sure that that's in the interest of the client and check with the client for permission and everything. But when I'm thinking about the ways that I get documents, it's often attorneys who want there to be some kind of exposure to what happened to their client, and get the permission that they need and share documents with me, whether that's like off the record or on background, or we can have conversations about different relationships that you can have that protect the provider of the information. I don't know. Yeah, I was just trying to list off a few ways of getting stuff.
Have you had success?
Yeah. So documents are obviously one sort of challenging set of evidence that you might want, but I have just been floored by the things that people will say if you ask them, because so many people existing in these systems just don't even realize that what they're doing is so damaging or so unconstitutional. When I was building the misdemeanor bail case in Harris County, I literally just asked the judges, like, do you consider ability to pay? They say, no, of course not. Like, do you think it would be helpful to have lawyers? Oh yeah, I really wish I had a public defender here for these people. Or, can you change the bail amounts? That the other judges said, no, it's not. It's out of my hands. These are like just like things that the best like courtroom moment that I ever had was this judge, a state court judge who was testifying about a private probation system in Rutherford County, Tennessee, and the federal judge asked him, aren't you just saying basically that you lock people up because they can't pay? And he was like, yeah, well, money makes the world go round. They don't even see what is happening
judge might be a little bit less likely to say that to me.
This was in federal court. I mean, it was on the record 2 months ago. I mean, it was outrageous.
So we will end there, but oh, sure, one comment.
Comment I want to say is this demonstrates that we're not in an ivory tower.
Yeah.
We're creating seeds for other people to flower.
And vice versa. So it's very generative. Thank you, Barbara, for that comment. So we will end there. I want to thank our panelists, Eli and Elizabeth, so much. And we would like you to join us for a snack and a beverage and a chance to ask more questions to Dan and the panelists and to engage in more conversation around this. And thank you for coming.